Hey there, everybody. Jeff Dalink here with Our Curious World, bringing you another story of the mysterious, the unexplained, and the just plain weird. So, as a kid growing up, I loved monster movies from the 1950s and the 60s. I wasn't so much into vampires and mummies, werewolves, and things like that. I liked the big city stomping monsters like the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Reptilicus. Perhaps the most famous of all these creatures, however, was Godzilla, the goofy Japanese monster that first appeared in 1954. He wasn't actually my favorite, but I still spent many wasted hours as a kid watching him battle other monsters like Mothra and Rodan and even King Kong. And as I got older, however, I began to wonder if there wasn't more to Godzilla than just his entertainment value. I'm one of those guys who sees metaphors everywhere, and I began to wonder if maybe there wasn't an underlying message behind the massive radioactive monster. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. In fact, we're going to look into the prospect that Godzilla was actually a not so subtle metaphor for the United States, as seen from the perspective of the Japanese. Crazy, you say? Maybe, but let's look into it anyway. So is Godzilla a metaphor for America? Before we get into that, a little bit of backstory is in order. For those who live in a Godzilla-free world, to briefly recap, Godzilla was a Japanese movie that first came out in 1954 about a fire-breathing, 400-foot-tall radioactive reptile that was supposedly created as a result of American hydrogen bomb testing after the Second World War. It appears quite suddenly off the coast of Japan one day, wades ashore without invitation, and generally lies waste to the Japanese countryside and, most unfortunately, the city of Tokyo. He is finally dispatched at the end, but only after it has left in its wake burning cities, toppled electrical towers, and a general melee among the Japanese citizenry. In case you're wondering, the beast was finally killed by a secret device called an oxygen destroyer, which removes oxygen from the water, causing all aquatic creatures in range to die of asphyxiation. It's somewhat anticlimactic to be sure, but it seemed to do the trick, at least until the creature managed to somehow later resurrect itself. In any case, it was pretty standard monster movie stuff at the time, and one that suffered from an especially hokey-looking monster played by some guy in a rubber suit stomping on miniature city sets. While such special effects might have been considered laughable by today's standards, they were the norm for the 50s. Thank God for CGI. Anyway, the movie was initially shown only in Japan, which makes sense since it was a Japanese movie. Proved to be marginally popular in the country. That might have been the end of things had it not been for the fact that financier and film distributor Joseph Levine bought the rights to the movie from the Japanese studio Toho for $25,000 and got MGM to pick it up for American audiences. Of course, the American version, subsequently titled Godzilla King of the Monsters, was heavily reworked and edited, with several scenes being added and deleted, all designed to appeal to its American audience. This included introducing Raymond Burr, that's right, the guy who played Perry Mason and later Ironsides, acting as narrator and media observer of the monster's nefarious acts. It also included one of the earliest examples of bad voice dubbing, which in itself proved to be even more entertaining than the movie itself, as audiences watched the lack of coordination between the actors' lips movements and the words that came out of their mouths. In any case, the movie premiered in American theaters in 1956 and proved to be a modest success. But even more important, however, it was instrumental in making Godzilla more recognized internationally, to the point that it kickstarted an entire genre of sequels that continue to be made even to this day. In fact, as of this writing, no fewer than 38 sequels have been made, 33 by Japanese filmmakers and 5 by American studios, with plans to make more always in the works. So what is it about this monster that gives it such a long shelf life? After all, no studio has ever attempted to create sequels around the other city-smashing monster movies of the 1950s, so what makes this particular franchise so popular? Could it be that there's something about Godzilla that speaks to the Japanese psyche we do not appreciate? Obviously there is, and I think I know what it is. Let's consider the plot for a moment. Here we have a giant radioactive reptile who suddenly appears to wreak havoc on the Japanese and their cities. Naturally, nothing can stop the massive creature despite the best efforts of the reconstituted Japanese military, which, despite going through a year's worth of ordnance in a few minutes, does nothing to stop or, for that matter, even faze the beast. In the end, after finishing its efforts at urban renewal, the creature finally lumbers back to the ocean and vanishes beneath its churning waters, a poignant reminder of the danger that science represents, at least insofar as atomic research is concerned. Now, there are several elements of the story that I find curious. First of all, the beast, despite being a mere animal, is impervious to everything the Japanese military throws at him. Missiles, artillery, machine gun fire, even strafing by fighter jets, does nothing to stop this bad boy, or for that matter, even seems to hurt him. Second, he burns entire cities to the ground, unlike most Hollywood monsters of the genre who simply knock things over and generally make a nuisance of themselves, leaving behind the hulks of smoldering ruins that resemble nothing so much as the burned-out cities seen during World War II in Japan and Germany. And third, and even more significant, the creature is radioactive. Those it doesn't kill by incinerating or crushing them, it kills with radiation poisoning, not unlike what happened in a couple of Japanese cities in August of 1945. Obviously, Godzilla is no mere animal. Instead, it's a super, irresistible, almost godlike entity capable of and intent on inflicting wanton, widespread death and destruction. Now ask yourself, what force has Japan faced in its history capable of such a thing? What entity came from the sea to level its cities and appeared impervious to the best efforts of the Japanese military to stop it? Does anything come to mind? How about the United States Army Air Force in 1945? Could Godzilla have been a metaphor for the B-29s that brought so much death, misery, and destruction to the island nation? Consider that General Curtis LeMay's bombers managed to, in the course of just a few months, level many of Japan's cities, leaving nearly 1 million dead, and even introduce the horror of the atomic bomb and the resultant radiation poisoning it brought with it. It was devastation on such a massive scale that the Japanese people to this day remain traumatized by it. And how much more so would have been the case in 1954, just 9 short years after the end of hostilities. Godzilla, then, in being the only thing capable of such carnage on a comparable scale, is the perfect metaphor not only for the United States Air Forces, but for the overwhelming strength of the United States itself. Godzilla is America. At least it was in the Japanese psyche at the time. Nonsense, some will claim. Godzilla is simply an imaginary movie monster, a product of the fertile imagination of some Japanese writers and directors, and realized in the guise of a guy in a goofy rubber suit stomping on model cities and battling toy tanks and planes. To read anything else into it is just silly. Really? Then why is Japan the only country on Earth to suffer widespread destruction from both American air power and from a mythological dragon beast? Why is Japan the only nation to suffer the ravages of the atomic bomb as well as the radioactively produced destruction meted out by Godzilla? And why is Japan the only country to experience radiation poisoning from both a real bomb and a fictional monster? To not see the parallels is to not pay attention. They're everywhere and easily seen by even the most casual observer. Need further proof? Okay. Godzilla came from the sea. So did the Americans, first by plane and then by ship. In fact, the land invasion of the home island, scheduled to begin in the fall of 1945, would have been entirely seaborne, just as all the island-hopping campaigns of the war had been up to that point. An enemy would come from the sea, just as they always did. Godzilla was unstoppable and impervious to the best efforts of the Japanese armed forces to stop it. So were LeMay's bombers. The Japanese threw literally everything they had at the American aircraft, but were unable to dent their ranks. In fact, for every bomber they did manage to bring down, 3 more were ready to take its place. No amount of firepower, determination, or even sacrificial bravery seemed to make any difference. The bombers just kept on coming in ever larger numbers. Godzilla destroyed Japan's cities with fire, and especially relished laying waste to Tokyo. Japanese cities in World War II often burned to the ground as a result of incendiary bombs, which found the wooden and paper houses of Japan a perfect and volatile fuel source. Tokyo was a favorite and oft-repeated target, with over 60% of the city eventually being reduced to ash by the end of the war. Godzilla was radioactive, so were the bombs dropped on Japan in August of 1945. What's especially telling is that radiation would kill more Japanese civilians than the atomic blasts themselves, making them doubly dangerous. Of course, radiation would kill a reptile, even a 400-foot tall one, just as easily as it would kill a 3-inch mouse. So making the monster radioactive makes no sense from a scientific standpoint, unless, of course, it's really a symbol for something else. Finally, while the monster was supposedly killed in the first Godzilla movie, that was seldom the case in the sequels. In most cases, after the creature dispatched its latest challenger, it always returned to the ocean to rejuvenate and ready itself for its next adventure. One could maintain that this mimics the fact that after several years of occupation, the Americans likewise returned to their homes across the ocean, ready and willing to fight again if need be, but needing to rest from their destructive ways. Could a more perfect metaphor be found? What is especially telling is that in the later sequels, Godzilla changes in much the same way Japan's relationship with America does. It was a gradual shift, to be sure, but to anyone who followed the Godzilla epics and their many excruciatingly bad sequels, it is apparent the monster begins to change from being Japan's destroyer to her protector. Instead of setting out to lay waste to Japan's cities, Godzilla shifted his efforts, towards fighting off other horrific beasts that threatened the Japanese homeland. Creatures, I believe, may have been representative of the other regional superpowers, like the Soviet Union and the Communist China that threatened Japan at the time. Did Godzilla then come to represent the only force, America, powerful enough to ensure its ultimate safety? Something to consider. It's interesting to note that in one of the sequels, Godzilla, after defeating or driving off its foes, was provided an island upon which the beast could live in relative safety, at least until the next time it was needed. Could this be a metaphor for Japan keeping her protector, America, on hand but at bay? It certainly appears that Japan wants us around, though not too close and hopefully not directly on her territory, if at all possible. Could Monster Island then possibly be a metaphor for Okinawa, the only substantial piece of Japanese real estate with a still significant American military presence? There's even a scene in the movie in which Godzilla seems to wave at the Japanese helicopters circling the island as though perceiving it as some genial toy. What a better metaphor for America and Japanese relationship at the time. A radioactive monster kept on a short leash, but one that might even be looked upon somewhat fondly by its former victims. Of course, it's still a dangerous creature and not entirely trustworthy, but at least it's now on their side. What a more appropriate way for the Japanese to describe the country at once decimated it and brought it to ruin, but now counts it as among its closest allies. Of course, things have changed since the Godzilla movies first came out. Japan is no longer a beaten foe, but an economic juggernaut and growing military power. It no longer fears America as it once did, but competes against her, which is perhaps the reason the Godzilla genre is starting to die out. Maybe Japan has outgrown its need for a metaphorical monster to placate and look to for protection. I think that's a positive thing, don't you? Say, if you like this video, I'd really appreciate you hit that like button and maybe consider subscribing to see more stories like this from our curious world. So I'm new to YouTube and really need your help to get this channel to grow so I can bring you more wacky, weird, and bizarre stuff like this. So here's your final thought of the day. To quote from the 2023 Godzilla movie, Godzilla -1, "This next battle is not waged to the death, but a battle to live for the future." Until next time, bye.